The grey light of dawn crawled over the English Channel. Waves slapped against steel hulls. Engines growled beneath a low ceiling of fog. From the cliffs of Normandy, German lookouts squinted into the haze and saw the impossible. The sea was moving. Out on the horizon, massive dark shapes floated forward, not ships, not barges, but something else. Concrete towers rising from the surf, each dragged by tugs through the churning water. The sound of chains and anchors echoed across the wind. These were not weapons, yet they would decide the fate of Europe. As Allied troops fought their way ashore at Omaha and Gold, behind them came these giants, the secret lifeline of the invasion. Each slab of steel and concrete carried the future of the war. Fuel, food, tanks, hope. Few knew their name. Fewer believed they could work. But by nightfall, the impossible would stand anchored off France, a harbor built in secrecy that would change history forever. By early 1944, the Allies faced a paradox. They had the men, they had the ships, they had the air power, but they did not have a port. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, Operation Overlord, had been set in motion. Tens of thousands of troops were massing in southern England. Assault ships lined up along the coast like a steel forest. But the real challenge was not the landing itself. It was what came after. An army can seize a beach, but it cannot live on sand. Every division would need fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles, spare parts, thousands of tons every single day. And the only deep water ports in northern France were heavily defended and mined by the Germans. Port of Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, all fortified behind concrete walls and artillery. Even if captured, they'd be ruined before the first Allied ship arrived. The German response to a seaborne invasion had been years in the making. Along the western coast of Europe, from Norway to the Spanish border, concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions formed a single deadly system: Atlantic Wall. Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, had reinforced it with mines, obstacles, and shore batteries determined to crush any landing before it could expand. Rommel believed the beaches were the key. If the Allies could be stopped there, no supply line could sustain them. And he was right. A modern invasion was not like the amphibious raids of earlier years. This was a continent-scale offensive, an army that would stretch across France and into Germany. It required something that had never been attempted in modern warfare: building a functioning deep-water port without capturing one. Allied planners understood the stakes. Without a working harbor, the invasion would stall. A stalled invasion would be pushed back into the sea. And if that happened, the road to Berlin would close for years. In London, military and engineering staffs pored over maps, logistics charts, and tide tables. They faced a brutal arithmetic. To support a single army group, they needed to offload thousands of tons per day. Landing craft alone could not sustain that. The beaches would be chaos, vulnerable to weather, tides, and German counterattack. Meanwhile, German defenses were tightening. Intelligence revealed mine belts stretching for miles, hidden gun emplacements, and artillery zeroed in on likely landing zones. Luftwaffe reconnaissance watched for any sign of Allied buildup, ready to strike shipping lanes. The Germans expected the Allies to come. They just didn't know when or where, but they believed one thing: the Allies could not sustain a long campaign on beaches alone. The Allies had to prove them wrong. And so, in the months leading to June 1944, a second war unfolded in secret, not of tanks or bombers, but of engineering. In quiet shipyards and coastal towns across Britain, a handful of planners began to imagine something radical. If the Allies couldn't take a port, they would build one, a floating harbor, one large enough to land an army. The challenge was staggering. It had to be constructed in Britain, towed across the Channel, anchored on open water, and withstand the brutal Atlantic storms. No military had ever attempted anything like it. Most thought it was madness. Some called it impossible. But in war, impossible ideas sometimes become the only option. The idea was born not from generals, but from engineers. In the summer of 1942, as Allied planners debated how to land in France, a quiet proposal emerged inside the British War Office. It came from a man named Hugh Iorus Hughes, a Welsh civil engineer. His suggestion sounded absurd. Construct artificial harbors, vast floating ports made of concrete and steel, tow them across the channel, and anchor them off the beaches after the invasion. The concept drew skepticism and laughter. Many senior officers dismissed it as a child's dream. How could something so enormous be moved, assembled, and operated in rough seas under enemy fire? Yet Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw potential. He remembered the disaster of Gallipoli in the First World War, where brave men had landed without a secure port and been slaughtered. He knew that this time, failure in logistics would mean failure in strategy. Churchill scrawled a note to his staff: "They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let us not argue the matter. The harbors shall be made." From that moment, the plan gained momentum. The project was codenamed Mulberry. Behind barbed wire and secrecy, the British and Americans split the task. 2 full harbors would be built: Mulberry A for the Americans at Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B for the British at Gold Beach. Each harbor would be the size of a major port, assembled from thousands of prefabricated sections built all over Britain, from shipyards in Glasgow to docks in London, from Welsh quarries to quiet coastal towns in Kent. They were to be assembled like a giant puzzle. The design was divided into parts, each with its own code name. Phoenix, massive hollow concrete caissons, some the size of apartment buildings, which would be sunk to form breakwaters. Whale, long floating roadways that connected ships to the shore. Spud, floating piers with adjustable legs that could rise and fall with the tide. Gooseberry, old ships deliberately sunk offshore to form a protective wall. It was engineering on a scale no military had ever attempted, a blend of civil, naval, and industrial genius. Each piece had to be built in secret, then moved across the channel in perfect sequence. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over 600,000 tons of concrete, 150,000 tons of steel, and 30 miles of floating roadways. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. Their intelligence never suspected that the Allies were constructing entire harbors in plain sight, disguised as normal shipping infrastructure, hidden behind code names and compartmentalized projects. Across Britain, civilians worked day and night, unaware of the full picture. Welders, dock workers, engineers, and soldiers built pieces of something greater than anyone could imagine. The secrecy was so intense that even those assembling the parts didn't know their final purpose. By early 1944, the prototypes were complete. Tests off the British coast proved that the structures could survive fierce waves and winds. The harbor sections floated, aligned, and locked into place like clockwork. Still, there was doubt. What if the weather turned? What if the tugs failed? What if German bombers spotted them during the crossing? But time was running out. D-Day had been set. The greatest invasion in history was about to begin, and with it, the greatest gamble in military engineering. If it worked, the Allies would have a lifeline into Europe. If it failed, hundreds of thousands of men could be stranded on the beaches. The moment of truth was approaching. They were not soldiers, but they fought a war of their own. In shipyards from Glasgow to Southampton, ordinary men and women turned wrenches, welded steel, and poured concrete under blackout lights. Dock workers, engineers, and civilian laborers, many too old or too young for combat, became the invisible army behind D-Day. Each section of the Mulberry Harbor had to be built to exacting precision. The Phoenix caissons, vast hollow blocks of reinforced concrete, were poured in flooded dry docks, towering 5 stories high. Hundreds of them lined Britain's estuaries, rising like silent gray fortresses along the coast. Every day, welders worked through fog and frost, often unaware of what they were making. The secrecy was total. Convoys of tugboats and barges moved pieces between assembly yards under armed escort. Naval engineers monitored every weld, every joint, every seal. The noise of hammers and cranes echoed day and night, a rhythm of urgency. Britain itself had become a construction site for liberation. These workers were never celebrated in parades. They didn't storm beaches or fly bombers, but without their hands, there would have been no invasion. Their work was measured not in medals, but in tons of steel, and in the quiet pride of knowing they helped build victory itself. For the generals, Mulberry was more than an engineering marvel. It was the keystone of Operation Overlord's entire survival plan. The Allies expected that the beaches would be chaotic in the first days. Landing craft could deliver troops, but not sustain them. Every vehicle, every artillery shell, every ration had to come by sea. Without a working port, the buildup would collapse under its own weight. The Mulberries were designed to bridge that gap, literally. Each harbor created an artificial bay, large enough to host cargo ships and tankers. Once anchored, the Phoenix breakwaters would calm the waves, forming a sheltered lagoon. From there, floating piers and roadways, the whales, stretched to the beaches, connecting ship to shore. Trucks could drive directly from a freighter's deck onto Normandy's sand. The goal was staggering. Each harbor needed to handle 7,000 tons of supplies per day, the equivalent of unloading an entire port city. Every piece had to be timed perfectly. As soon as the beaches were secure, tugs would begin hauling in sections from Britain. The Americans would build Mulberry A at Omaha Beach, the British Mulberry B at Gold. Both would be operational within days, but it was more than a logistical plan. It was a strategic weapon. Mulberry meant momentum, a way to turn a fragile beachhead into a sustained offensive. It allowed tanks, trucks, and reinforcements to pour into France faster than the Germans could react. For the men landing on D-Day, the Mulberry harbors were invisible. But for the planners, they were everything, the hidden arteries of victory. Nothing like the Mulberry harbors had ever existed before. Each component was a triumph of wartime innovation, designed to survive the fury of the English Channel and the brutality of war. The Phoenix caissons were the foundation, massive concrete blocks, some weighing 6,000 tons. They were towed into position and sunk to form the outer walls. Behind them, the bombarded floating breakwaters, steel pontoons shaped like diamonds, absorbed the waves, protecting the inner harbor. Inside this calm zone floated the spuds, pierheads mounted on giant legs that could raise and lower with the tide, keeping decks level for unloading. Long, flexible steel bridges called whales connected these piers to the shore, supported by floating pontoons named beetles. Every joint, every hinge had to endure relentless motion, waves, wind, and weight. The engineering tolerances were razor-thin. If one piece failed, the entire chain could collapse. Even the anchors were revolutionary, huge kite anchors that bit into the seabed like claws, holding the structures steady against storms. Together, they formed a city at sea, a living organism that rose and fell with the tides. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. Ships, cranes, and steel sprawled across the water. But to the engineers who designed it, it was harmony, a mechanical symphony that turned raw ocean into the world's largest temporary port. It was the ultimate expression of Allied ingenuity, proof that in this war, victory belonged not only to those who fought with guns, but to those who built with imagination. For all their defenses, the Germans never saw it coming. By mid-1944, Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, thousands of bunkers, gun emplacements, and minefields. Every inch of France's coast had been fortified. Yet behind that iron wall was a fatal blind spot: intelligence arrogance. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but believed it would hinge on capturing a deep-water port, Cherbourg, Le Havre, or Calais. Their analysts dismissed the idea that the Allies could sustain an army across open beaches. To them, the sea itself was the ultimate defense. When the first aerial photos showed strange concrete shapes being assembled along the British coast, the German High Command called them anti-submarine defenses or coastal barriers. No one guessed they were pieces of harbors. Even the Abwehr, German military intelligence, missed the clues buried in intercepted communications. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for defending the French coastline, had argued passionately that the enemy would try something unprecedented. He was right, but his warnings were drowned out by bureaucratic disbelief. When D-Day came, German observers saw ships unloading supplies at impossible speed, even as artillery thundered inland. At first, they assumed the Allies had captured a port. Only days later did reconnaissance planes reveal the truth. The ports had been brought to France. It was one of the greatest intelligence failures of the war. Germany had prepared for an invasion, but not for imagination. At the highest levels of command, the Mulberry Project was a monumental gamble. The idea had been Winston Churchill's. Inspired by a memo he wrote back in 1917, Piers. For use on beaches, they must float up and down with the tide. 27 years later, as Prime Minister, he resurrected that idea and demanded it be made real. Engineers protested. Admirals doubted it. You can't build harbors out of tin and hope they'll survive the channel, one officer warned. But Churchill was relentless. He knew that capturing a French port intact was impossible. The Germans would destroy them all. The only option was to bring the ports with them. Eisenhower, leading the Allied Expeditionary Force, understood the stakes. The entire invasion plan depended on a continuous flow of supplies. If Mulberry failed, Overlord would grind to a halt on the sand. Thousands of tons of steel and concrete were committed, at the expense of ships, tanks, and aircraft production. Every decision was a trade-off. Churchill pushed through resistance with characteristic force, personally reviewing prototypes in rough seas. When one early model survived a storm off Garleyston, he smiled and said, "That will do." Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, embraced the concept fully. His staff coordinated landing schedules, bridge connections, and construction units to make it work in the chaos of invasion. These leaders understood that victory in modern war didn't depend on bravery alone. It depended on logistics. The Mulberry harbors became their act of faith in science, planning, and willpower. When those vast floating walls finally took shape off Normandy, Churchill's gamble paid off. The invasion was no longer a desperate landing. It was a bridgehead. Permanent, growing, unstoppable. Wars are remembered for battles, not for the bridges that made them possible. But behind every victory lies a quiet kind of violence, the machinery of supply. The Mulberry harbors were triumphs of ingenuity, but also instruments of destruction. Every ton of ammunition unloaded through them fueled bombardments that leveled towns and shattered armies. The same engineering that made them elegant also made them deadly efficient. In the calm after D-Day, soldiers sometimes looked at the endless stream of ships unloading through the harbors and whispered, "That's what winning looks like." But for the French villagers nearby, victory looked like ruins, walls torn apart by shells that had arrived through Mulberry's steel veins. There's an irony in the story. The harbors were built with patience, precision, and hope, yet their purpose was to deliver death faster. Still, without them, the war might have lasted years longer. Every bridge section, every concrete block shortened suffering elsewhere. The engineers who built Mulberry weren't thinking about glory or destruction. They were thinking about solving a problem. In the end, that's what makes this invention so human. It was both creative and cruel, magnificent and merciless. The perfect reflection of a war where imagination became a weapon. The unseen hands, the visionary leaders, the blind enemy, all converged in one moment of truth. Because soon, the storm would come. And with it, the real test of whether a floating city could survive the wrath of the sea and the weight of history. June 6, 1944, 05:30 a.m. The gray dawn over Normandy erupted in fire and steel. Allied warships thundered from the horizon, the sea trembling under thousands of shells. Landing craft surged forward, packed with soldiers who could barely hear over the roar of engines and guns. Behind them, out beyond the smoke and chaos, something even larger was stirring, a convoy unlike any in history. It wasn't carrying men to fight, but the machines to make victory possible. The Mulberry harbors. In the days that followed the landings, as beaches turned from battlefields into fragile footholds, the real invasion began, one of engineering. Tugboats and small freighters began towing enormous shapes across the channel. Strange, hulking silhouettes that looked like pieces of a drowned city being raised from the deep. Each of those shapes had a name: Phoenix, Whale, Beetle, Spud. Together, they would become the arteries of an army. The first to arrive was the American Mulberry A off Omaha Beach, followed by the British Mulberry B off Gold Beach. The assembly began immediately, under sniper fire, air raids, and the constant threat of storms. Naval engineers and combat engineers worked side by side, sometimes waist-deep in freezing surf. anchoring caissons and connecting roadways while artillery boomed inland. On June 8th, just 2 days after D-Day, the first Phoenix caissons were sunk into position. They dropped slowly beneath the waves, sealing themselves to the seabed like colossal tombstones. One after another, they formed an outer wall half a mile long, a breakwater against the violent tides of the channel. Within a week, both mulberries began to take shape, vast outlines of floating piers stretching toward the beaches, ships lined up to unload cargo. The first trucks rolled down the whale bridges, carrying ammunition, rations, and medical supplies straight onto French soil. By June 18th, Mulberry A was already handling 1,600 tons of supplies per day, and Mulberry B even more. For the first time, an invading army was being supplied not from a captured port, but from one built entirely at sea. Observers described it as surreal, a floating city alive with movement. Cranes swung in rhythm. Cargo nets rose and fell, trucks rattled across steel spans, waves breaking against walls of concrete. From the air, the harbors glowed at night with thousands of work lights, visible for miles, a beacon of the Allied advance. Eisenhower called it one of the most remarkable feats of engineering ever achieved. But beneath the triumph was tension. Meteorologists began warning of worsening weather. The English Channel, calm and forgiving for D-Day, was turning restless. The tides grew erratic, winds sharpened by the hour. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, overseeing naval operations, noted in his diary, "If the channel turns against us, the harbors may not hold." Still, work continued. Every hour mattered. Supplies were racing to support the breakout from Normandy, fuel for Patton's tanks, shells for artillery, food for hundreds of thousands of men. The Allies couldn't afford a pause. As the engineers secured the last sections of Mulberry, waves began to rise like slow-breathing beasts. The winds carried the scent of salt and storm. One officer at Omaha wrote, "It was as if the sea was warning us." By June 18th nightfall, the Mulberries stood proudly against the horizon, two monumental symbols of Allied ingenuity and resolve. They had survived the invasion, defied the tides, and proven every skeptic wrong. But beyond that darkening horizon, a new threat was gathering, one far greater than the Germans. A storm the likes of which the Channel hadn't seen in decades was rolling in. And when it struck, it would decide whether the dream of a floating harbor would live or die. June 19th, 1944, 04 Sun AM. The wind came without warning. What began as a steady gust by dawn had turned by noon into a roaring gale. The gray calm that had protected the invasion for nearly 2 weeks shattered. Out in the Channel, waves began to tower, slamming into the fragile skeletons of the mulberries. The engineers had feared this moment. Not the enemy, not even the Luftwaffe, but the sea itself. The barometer dropped fast. Ships fought to hold their anchors. Floating piers twisted like snakes. The whales, those long steel roadways that connected the harbor's piers to the shore, buckled under the force. It sounded like the scream of metal being torn apart, one officer wrote. By midday, winds reached over 60 miles per hour, the sea rising to 20 feet. Landing craft were thrown against the Phoenix caissons. Tugboats were swallowed whole. The sky vanished in spray and rain. On Omaha Beach, Mulberry A, the American harbor, took the full brunt. Engineers tried desperately to detach sections before they shattered, but it was too late. Caissons cracked apart, concrete blocks the size of buildings slammed into one another. Floating piers snapped, their ends curling upward like broken fingers. By June 20th, the once proud harbor had become a graveyard of wreckage. Only twisted metal and half-sunken caissons remained, their outlines visible beneath churning waves. When the storm finally broke on June 22nd, Mulberry A was gone. The engineers stood in silence, staring out at the ruins. Some wept openly. What had taken months of secret planning and weeks of heroic construction under fire had been destroyed in 3 days. Aboard his command ship, Admiral Kirk sent a grim message to Eisenhower. Mulberry A is wrecked beyond repair. Yet across the coast, the British Mulberry B at Gold Beach, shielded by geography and luck, had survived. Damaged, yes, but still standing. Engineers immediately set to work salvaging every part they could. American crews sent whatever remained from Omaha to help the British effort. The two harbors had been designed as twins. Now, the war depended on one. In the weeks that followed, Mulberry Bee became the beating heart of the Allied invasion. The British called it Port Winston, a tribute to Churchill's vision. Against all odds, the floating harbor processed nearly 2 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles before the end of the campaign. Even as the Normandy breakout began, supplies flowed without pause, a stream of steel and fuel feeding the liberation of France. The destruction of Mulberry A had forced the Americans to adapt. They began using smaller landing craft and portable docks directly onto the beach, perfecting a new method called rhino ferries. Improvisation became survival and success. Eisenhower later reflected, "Without those harbors, without the courage to improvise when one failed, we could never have sustained the armies that broke through Normandy." The storm, in the end, became both tragedy and test, destroying one masterpiece to prove the resilience of the other. And perhaps most strikingly, the Germans never truly understood what had been achieved. Their intelligence believed the Allies had captured Cherbourg early, not realizing the supplies were coming ashore through an artificial port. Even after the war, many German officers marveled that such a structure had ever existed. By July, as the Allied front pushed inland, the remnants of Mulberry A still lay offshore. Massive blocks of concrete, now serving as makeshift breakwaters for landing craft. Divers would later find them covered in barnacles, the silent bones of a lost engineering city. One British engineer wrote in his journal, "We built a harbor in the middle of the sea, and the sea took it back." But not before it did its duty. When Eisenhower visited Gold Beach weeks later, he stood on one of the whale bridges, watching trucks rumble past. "This," he said quietly, "is what victory looks like." The Mulberries had turned the tide, not through firepower, but through foresight, collaboration, and engineering genius. They transformed invasion into permanence, chaos into momentum, but the storm had left its mark, a reminder that even the greatest human invention was still at the mercy of nature. As one naval officer later wrote, "We built the impossible, and then the sea reminded us who really commands the battlefield." The ruins of Mulberry still lie today beneath the waves off Omaha Beach, silent, enduring, and half buried in sand. The sea that once destroyed them now guards their memory. When the skies finally cleared over Normandy in late June 1944, the beaches looked more like a scrapyard than a battlefield. Broken pontoons, twisted steel bridges, half-sunken caissons, all scattered along the surf like the ribs of a dead leviathan. But amid the wreckage, the work never stopped. The Allies knew that the real Battle of Normandy wasn't just being fought in the hedgerows, it was being fought in tons, in gallons, in the daily flow of supplies that kept 500,000 men alive. Within 48 hours of the storm's end, the surviving harbor at Gold Beach, Mulberry Bee, became the center of the Allied world. Crews worked day and night to repair it. New whales were welded on site, spare caissons hauled from British stockpiles, and improvised piers hammered into place by exhausted engineers who hadn't slept in days. The results were staggering. Within the first week after reopening, Mulberry Bee was unloading 6,000 tons per day, double what German intelligence had predicted. By mid-July, it reached nearly 9,000 tons daily, the equivalent of a major continental port. Convoys streamed in almost continuously. Liberty ships anchored at the outer breakwaters, offloading tanks, trucks, and crates of ammunition. KW amphibious trucks drove directly off floating causeways and onto the beaches, their tires splashing through shallow surf. At its peak, the harbor handled nearly 40% of all Allied supplies entering France, feeding the 21st Army Group's relentless advance inland. Meanwhile, the American forces at Omaha, despite losing their own harbor, displayed remarkable adaptability. Without Mulberry A, they improvised a system of direct beach landings, using rhino ferries, massive pontoon platforms with outboard engines, to shuttle tanks and jeeps straight from ships to shore. The result was an astonishing logistical performance. Even without a functioning artificial port, the Americans were landing over 16,000 tons of supplies per day by late July, proving that ingenuity could outpace disaster. Eisenhower's headquarters compiled the data into a secret report marked, "For Supreme Commander only." The conclusion was simple. The Mulberry operation, despite loss of one unit, has achieved its object. The invasion has been sustained. German intelligence, however, failed to understand what had truly happened. The Abwehr and Luftwaffe reconnaissance teams noticed the floating piers but dismissed them as temporary docks. A report to Berlin in late June claimed, "The Allies appear to be using pre-existing French coastal ports to sustain the invasion." They never grasped that the Allies had brought their own ports, and that these floating harbors were now delivering more supplies than Cherbourg itself. For the men on the ground, the difference was life and death. Ammunition arrived on time, food rations never ran out, and fresh troops flowed steadily to the front. By contrast, the Wehrmacht was crippled by fuel shortages and shattered rail lines. By the end of July 1944, over 2 million men, 4 million tons of material, and 500,000 vehicles had crossed the beaches, the majority through the Mulberries and the beach operations inspired by them. Winston Churchill later summarized it best: "Victory in Normandy was a triumph of the engineer and the workman as much as of the soldier." To many who had seen the floating harbor with their own eyes, it was more than a feat of engineering. It was proof of Allied unity and imagination. British and American soldiers often joked that Jerry still thinks we captured a port somewhere. In truth, they had built one, piece by piece, in the open sea. The broken remains of Mulberry A were not left to waste either. U.S. engineers salvaged dozens of caissons to create makeshift breakwaters and jetties along the Normandy coast. Even in ruin, the harbor continued to serve. It was a quiet kind of victory, not won in gunfire, but in concrete, steel, and sheer persistence. The Germans never bombed the Mulberries again. By the time they realized what they were, the tide of the war had already shifted. By July's end, the Mulberry story had become something more than an engineering success. It was a turning point in the entire Western Front campaign. The logistical chain born on the beaches of Normandy would feed the Allied push across France. Every tank that rolled, every bomber that flew from newly captured airfields, and every bullet fired in the breakout battles of Saint-Lô and Caen could be traced back to those floating harbors offshore. From Gold Beach, Mulberry B continued operating for a remarkable 10 months, even through the brutal Channel winter. It unloaded over 2.5 million men, 4 million tons of cargo, and 500,000 vehicles, before being decommissioned in early 1945. No conventional port captured during the war ever matched that level of throughput, so quickly Eisenhower himself called it the Bridge of Victory. Without it, he later admitted, the pace of the Allied advance might have slowed fatally, giving Germany time to regroup behind the Seine. In his private post-war reflections, he wrote, "The success of the Normandy invasion depended upon the miracle of logistics. Without Mulberry, we might still have been on the beaches. For the Germans, the loss of the Atlantic Wall's illusion of invincibility was devastating. The Führer's generals had promised that any invasion would die on the sand. Instead, the Allies had turned the sand into a highway." Intercepted German communications in July 1944 revealed the disbelief inside the OKW. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. One officer complained, "We had thought to starve them on the beaches. Instead, they feed on the sea." This misunderstanding of Allied capability became one of the Reich's fatal errors. Even as panzer divisions counterattacked, the Allies' logistical superiority made their resistance meaningless. German fuel convoys were bombed daily, rail networks collapsed, and artillery batteries ran out of ammunition while American trucks rolled past in endless lines. The lessons of the Mulberry operation didn't end in Normandy. They reshaped Allied thinking about mobility, amphibious warfare, and joint operations. The same engineers who designed the floating harbors later advised on Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, and even contributed ideas for temporary port systems in the Pacific. Churchill remained deeply proud of it. In a 1947 speech to Parliament, he described Mulberry as a triumph of imagination, an idea so simple and yet so vast that it seemed impossible until it stood upon the sea. Behind that triumph were thousands of ordinary men, steel workers from Middlesbrough, dockhands from Liverpool, American seabees from Virginia and Boston, who had built an entire port network in secrecy, without fanfare, then watched it rewrite the course of the war. By autumn 1944, as Allied troops broke through into Belgium, the Mulberry's contribution became clear in the statistics. Eisenhower's staff compiled $500,000. Men landed 500,000 vehicles, delivered thousand tons of supplies moved through Normandy's, beaches and harbors numbers that turned D-Day from a landing into liberation. Strategically, it marked the end of Germany's control of Western Europe. Once the Allies secured a steady flow of men and material, the defeat of the Reich became a matter of time. Hitler's armies could no longer match a war machine fed by the floating ports of the Channel, and so the Mulberry harbors, born from panic over how to land an army, became the foundation of victory. They proved that in modern war, steel and imagination can be as decisive as gunfire. Even decades later, remnants of the harbors remain visible at Arromanches, their broken silhouettes rising from the surf at low tide, concrete ghosts of an impossible dream, the day men built a city on the sea and changed history. The engineers who once feared they might fail had, in the end, built the very bridge that carried freedom into Europe. The war would move on, to Paris, to the Rhine, to Berlin, but it would always trace its path back to Normandy, and to the miracle that made it possible. War has always been a contest of courage and destruction, but the Mulberry harbors revealed another face of power: patience, precision, and quiet genius. Long after the guns of Normandy fell silent, the sea itself still remembered the geometry of steel and tide, the shape of a victory not forged by generals alone, but by planners, welders, and dreamers who imagined the impossible and made it float. Germany's spies had searched for the weapons that would break the Atlantic Wall. They expected tanks, ships, and bombers, not an entire harbor that could be built in secret, towed across the Channel, and anchored under fire. That blindness was not just a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. The Allies had won by seeing beyond destruction, by understanding that invasion was not only about landing men, but sustaining them. Mulberry was the proof that logistics was not the backroom of war. It was the war. Behind every bullet fired in Normandy stood a bridge of concrete and steel lying quietly under the waves. And behind every name remembered on the beaches stood thousands more who never saw combat, but who made combat possible. Modern armies still live in Mulberry's shadow. Every offshore platform, every mobile base, every humanitarian port echoes its design. It taught that technology is not only about killing more efficiently, but surviving longer, reaching farther, believing that even nature can be persuaded to serve human purpose. And yet, there is humility in it too. For the sea that once carried salvation also claimed one of its own harbors in a storm, a reminder that no matter how ingenious the plan, the elements remain sovereign. In the end, Germany never knew that America and her allies had built not just a floating harbor, but a bridge of will across an ocean, a structure made of steel, secrecy, and faith that ingenuity could win where brute force could not. They thought invasion came with guns, but victory in truth arrived on the tide.